Hi, and welcome to another episode of Dynamically Speaking. I'm your host, Kelly O'Dwyer-Manuel. With me today is the Chief Product Officer for Axiomatics, Mark Cassetta. Welcome, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kelly. Great to be here.
Excellent. So what we want to talk about today is a subject that I know is near and dear to your heart because we've talked about it many times over the years, which is zero trust. So I'm going to dive right in here because it seems like we're not the only two people talking about zero trust. Certainly, zero trust is everywhere right now, which leads me to my first question. We know that zero trust isn't new. It's been around for, gosh, I think at least 10 years. So why are we at this kind of tipping point in 2022 where you can't go online to any security site or information site without hearing something about zero trust?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Kelly. I think that if we rewind the tape, right, and think about when did zero trust start to really come to fruition, and some arguments go back to 2007, 2008. Often they lead to a paper that John Kindervag wrote in 2010 called No More Chewy Centers. And what's really interesting is when you read that paper, what John talks about, what he talks about the broader call it activity happening in the market, the cybercrime, the reasons why we need to change, and you parallel that to what's happening today, it's the similarities. Like it's almost like the paper was written, last week, when in fact it was written, I guess, 12 years ago. And yeah, of course, when we talk about the technology and all that goodness, that's all certainly evolved over the last 12 years. But the fundamental challenge and the pain and the essence of what zero trust is looking to solve is directly at the center of what we are living today. So the question is, well, why is it taking 12 years? Like anything, there's an adoption. When we talked about the adoption or the maturity of dynamic authorization or externalized authorization. Well, we could apply the same logic to zero trust. And yes, zero trust is a strategy. It's not one technology. It's multiple components that come together to deliver on a strategy. But if we think of it through the lens of a technology adoption curve, there's the innovators, right? And so those innovators, were the ones that, were picking up on sort of this message probably back in 2010, 2011, 2012. And at the time, zero trust was conceptually made a lot of sense. But practically speaking, how do we get there? How do we actually implement this? Well, that's where you got to go from the innovators into the early adopters. And the early adopters are the ones that started to kind of bring this into an organization. Some maybe were successful, some failed, maybe some were reliant on some change in technology, especially when we think of the evolution of the perimeter, the evolution of the endpoint, the evolution of cloud. And then we hit the chasm, right? And the chasm, of course, is where there's a question of are people really going to adopt this? And something that I always sort of tested going back to even my days at Titus, because Titus, as much as we were about data and unstructured data and less about the network, the ultimate goal of zero trust was data protection. And so we were always talking about Titus, or trying to have a conversation about Titus in the context of zero trust. So I'd ask customers, are you thinking about a zero trust strategy? Or have you thought about zero trust? And I would test this on all the calls we'd have. And frankly, between 2015 and 2020, it wasn't coming up as much. It was, this sounds like something we've got to think about, but there wasn't that mass acceleration towards zero trust. And then we fast forward to 2020, and what happens? Well, what the essence of zero trust was like, look, let's think of a world where people are everywhere, where access is everywhere, and seemingly that happened overnight, within a matter of weeks. And all of a sudden, the entire kind of world stood up and said, wait a second, I've got to rethink how I'm securing information. And zero trust was that playbook. And all along, we had great analysts like Dr. Chase Cunningham, who was picking up on John's research after he'd left Forrester and started writing out playbooks and maturity models about how to get there. And so I think it was kind of a perfect storm. We had this kind of forced push to say, okay, the reality is your current security model isn't going to work anymore. There was a lot of great research to say, okay, here's how you're going to do it. And then the cybersecurity market, being driven by innovation, was already building technology to get there. And so I think that sort of perfect storm over the last couple of years has led organizations to realize that adopting a zero trust strategy is actually much more of a reality than it may have been 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And so we're not just seeing people talk about it, through one product lens. We're seeing organizations talk about it as a strategy. And so today, in every single customer call that I'm on, I ask the question, or I confirm, are you aligning in the conversations we're having, dynamic authorization or externalized authorization is zero trust? And the 100% answer every time is yes. This is about a broader zero trust strategy. And then I think in parallel, frankly, when you see sort of the White House directives on this, that just adds to the momentum. And that's what's brought us here today.
That makes a lot of sense. So talking about, and that's interesting to me that you're saying that you're getting that almost, to a person feedback that authorization is being considered within a broader zero trust security initiative. Do people then really understand, because we've also talked in conversations about the fact that this is also, really a watershed moment for authorization for a lot of the same reasons that you've seen, that you just cited, for zero trust. We're seeing that mirrored in authorization more often than not. So with that in mind, do people understand what role authorization plays as part of a zero trust strategy, and maybe more specifically, what's your opinion as to the role authorization plays as part of a zero trust strategy?
Yeah, I think that the market is being better educated on the role that authorization plays, and even having discussions like this hopefully will be helpful to folks as they try to figure that out. The really interesting thing is, when you look at the core principles of zero trust and around things like continuous verification of access at all points of the resource, leveraging models such as attribute-based access control. And this isn't just about authorization. This is across users, devices, data, endpoints, networks, workloads. Those core principles have always been the foundation of externalized authorization, right? So let's externalize the enforcement point. Let's apply attribute-driven policies, attribute-based access control. Let's get granular, fine-grained policies. Let's pull context and sources in at all levels of the application and all resources to make sure that the individual or the machine that's trying to access this resource is in fact allowed to do it at this point in time. It's not about, hey, they're allowed to do it yesterday, so they can do it today. It's no, well, can they do it right now? Because the context around them may have changed, right?
Right.
They've moved locations. They're no longer at the office. They're working from a coffee shop, whatever it might be. So I guess the going back to your question, do people understand? I think if you understand conceptually the idea of zero trust, then if you bring that to authorization specifically, there's really two ways you've got to think about it. There is this need to manage authorization, and there's this need to deploy authorization policies or runtime authorization policies. And that's where the confusion sometimes lays, because when it comes to managing authorization, that's where we start to see things like privileged access management solutions, or I call it sort of the brains of identity and access management, that are helping to kind of maintain least privilege or just-in-time access. Whereas there's also actually building the physical policies for applications at runtime, which is where, for example, Axiomatics fits in. And so, trying to kind of decipher those two worlds a little bit can sometimes cause some confusion, but I think the market's getting better at understanding that.
Okay, that's interesting. So I'm gonna tweak. I had a question for you, but I'm gonna tweak it a little bit here. So I know, we're in terms of the maturity of the conversation that's around zero trust, we've moved, to your point, from the conversation of years and years ago as to what is zero trust and why should people consider it, now to where do I start? And I do want to ask you where people start, but I think more importantly, Mark, where are people getting it wrong when they start in on these implementations of zero trust leveraging authorization? What's the best way to start, and are there times where people are getting off on the wrong foot here?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to answer that question by actually completing one of the answer to the other question that I didn't get to fully complete because I forgot about it, which is, because I said all of a sudden zero trust entered a chasm. I didn't talk about it actually coming out of the chasm. Well, the momentum in 2010 is what brought it out of the chasm. Well, okay, so now, okay, so the question is, where are people getting it wrong? So we've gone from the chasm, right? And how do you get out of the chasm? Well, you have proven a repeatable process. You've proven that this can be done. You've proven that this has solved problems. You've established best practices. You've and the people that are going to adopt this as the early majority, though, aren't going to want to take risks, right? So they're going to be looking for making sure that they follow best practices to be successful. So now coming to your question, what are some of those best practices, and where, if I'm part of that early majority that doesn't have any appetite to fail, I'm, and I want to be successful with zero trust. I think the first thing is to not boil the ocean. And that seems maybe obvious for any kind of strategy or any kind of deployment or change you want to bring to an organization. But the challenge with zero trust is, because it's so widely dispersed, it's not just about one part of the security reference architecture. It is your security strategy. And so where do you start? And if you try to take zero trust and deploy it wholeheartedly across the entire organization and say, thou shalt, apply this strategy to everything, I think you can create confusion and probably not bring the clarity that you're hoping to bring with the strategy, or have the impact you want to have. So that, I think, is where people can go wrong. So how do you address that? Well, that's where I'm a big fan of compartmentalizing in anything that we do. And when it comes to zero trust itself, compartmentalizing into, what is that crawl stage, and what does it mean to crawl? Well, crawl means proving that you can get value out of the strategy and being able to do this in a rinse and repeatable fashion. It's not about doing it it's not about deploying something or deploying your zero trust strategy to multiple components of your reference architecture. It's about getting it right in one of those components and showing the business that you can be successful in that activity, and then taking that momentum into perhaps another component and building up from there. And look, when you think it, I always find this interesting. There's no quick wins with zero trust. It's like there, we're just going to turn on MFA. Well, I talked to some organizations. That's a 2-year journey, right? And so maybe if you're a 200-person organization, okay, that might be a little bit different. But yeah, I mean, I would hesitate to say that there's going to be quick wins. I think that the objective is to get the right wins and to do it in a way that people that brings clarity to the strategy that you're trying to deploy, and shows the impact and the value that it can bring. And from there, we'll pull on the Canadian analogy. There's a bit of a hockey stick opportunity, right? So you can get that momentum and start, prove that you can make it happen, and then ramp up from there as needed.
That's good, because one of my questions was going to be, what does winning in zero trust look like? So I think you've actually answered that, which is great. So I want to move on to speaking, of strategies and success here. I think you'd be hard pressed to name a security vendor that isn't talking about how they fit into zero trust. So for Axiomatics, what does a zero trust strategy look like? What is the company's point of view on zero trust, and how are we uniquely positioned then to deliver on that for customers? What does that look like?
So, if we want to take it down specifically to authorization, and talk, about what's happening, what we have to consider around building zero trust into, or adopting zero trust principles and strategies into authorization. It starts in a couple different ways. So the first thing, first key principle to me is continuous verification, right? So that's and by design, an externalized authorization strategy is going to do that. It's at runtime, it never sleeps, it's continuously verifying access. That's the first thing. The second, though, is you're building policies based on, as John Kinderberg says, the Kipling method, right? So who, what, where, when, why, and how. And so that becomes the next thing. Now, are you going to get all of those attributes every single time? Maybe, and maybe that would be great. In some instances, you might not have that information, but I think that's kind of a model that you want to think about as you're starting to build out policies. The third, though, is when we start thinking about those policies are the types of attributes that we're pulling in. And so when I start to think about zero trust, I mean, the ultimate, it's all about risk, right? You're never, you don't trust anybody. So how do you're going to have to make a decision at some point about whether or not someone's allowed to have that entitlement within the application. So what's an attribute that can give you that confidence or that degree of confidence? Well, that to me comes down to risk. And so how do you define risk? Well, risk can come from a whole bunch of different things, right? Risk could be something as simple as, how did the person access the app? Where did they access the app from? That might be one way to define risk. But we're also seeing, risk come in the form of its own attributes. When you think of things like user behavioral analytics solutions that have, they kind of came to market in 2013, 2014. I think most of them probably got acquired or built into a lot of the platform players. So many of the platforms that I would say most organizations probably have, I'd say enterprise organizations probably have some semblance of a risk attribute that they can deliver on. So being able to pull those kinds of attributes into your policy is important. Oh, just 1 second. Yeah, hi, Megan. Okay. I knew I shouldn't have kept my window open. So anyways, that to me would be the key places to start.
Well, thank you, Mark. I think that's all the time we have today, but that was excellent. And I'm sure I'm going to have lots of follow-up questions, which will mean another conversation about zero trust, because certainly, with the landscape evolving as quickly as it is, I think there's lots more to chat about. But thank you very much for your time, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Thank you, Kelly. It's always a pleasure.